Today's the feast of our patron of our little priestly fraternity that we have for ourselves here at St. Gertrude's, as well as one of the patrons of Cincinnati, St. Francis de Sales. And St. Francis de Sales embodied everything that you could, I think, in the way of care for, work for conversion of souls. He did so much work with an air of sweetness and an air of desire to attract people to the faith from the very beginning, with complete disregard to anything else, whether it be his own safety, or it be his own health, or be however much effort or time that it took to do so. He patiently went along, gaining one soul at a time, until it became a great multitude. He was born, of course, of great nobility in Savoy, and his parents, for their sake, they expected and really desired for him to marry and to continue on the family name and to inherit the family fortune and everything like this. Francis, for his part, wanted nothing to do with that. He wanted to become a priest. He wanted to become a priest so earnestly, and his father was shocked to hear that and was vehemently against it. Yet Francis remained unwavered in his decision that no, this is my vocation in life, to the point that finally his own mother had to stand in and tell his father that indeed there is no way to be able to stand against such a strong devotion as it would be to stand directly in the way of the will of God itself. And so with that, finally, the father relented and gave his blessing to his son to go and continue his studies in Paris and to become a priest. In time after his ordination had taken place, he went to the area of near Geneva in Switzerland, some parts of the work just over the river into France, and some of the work in some of the towns in Switzerland. And there he found for himself a truly a situation that was vehemently against what he was going to do, the work for converting the Calvinists that had taken over there in Switzerland, that had a deep hatred for the Catholic Church. In fact, very shortly after his arrival, there were many attempts that were made on his life. Many a man had sworn to themselves that they would indeed one day slay the preacher who was trying to convert people out of Calvinism. A certain man actually took it to the point of making it a vow for himself. He vowed to God that he would one day kill him, and made several attempts to do so, including attempts in which where he had contingency plans if he were to fail or if something were to happen. One last such attempt had him with pistols in his hands, and not trusting that his own pistols would fire. Later on down the road that he knew that the saint would walk, he had other men with weapons as well, spaced out throughout, so that if he got by him and both of his pistols didn't fire for some strange reason, well, the next one or the next one after that, and so on, would eventually get him. Well, St. Francis de Sales came very happily walking down the pathway that they expected him to, and sure enough, the man pulls out his guns and he tries to fire upon the saint, and click, click, nothing happens. And he realizes, oh no, the pistols didn't fire just as I had supposed that maybe they wouldn't. But no worries, my contingency plan is in place. And he watched Francis de Sales continue on down the pathway, right past one after another of the assassins, who never even moved from their places of concealment. It was a great miracle that it worked, that while he could see Francis de Sales, nobody else that was waiting for him could. God had made him invisible to them. And with that miracle witnessed by his would-be assassin, he was converted on the spot and bitterly wept of his own sinfulness and his own wrongdoing, and not only converted and became a Catholic, but soon afterwards, for the rest of his days, was a great supporter of the life and the work of St. Francis de Sales, and followed him whenever he had the opportunity to, would come and listen to his sermons. The sermons were one of the most important aspects of the apostolate of St. Francis de Sales. He would preach just about every single day, every opportunity that he had to preach about something of the faith, to teach people about something that would hold their interest or edify them or bring them up a little bit. He seized upon, whether it be large crowds or small crowds. He also went about doing so by the way of small articles. All of the Calvinists had these animosities towards the faith because they had been drilled in their head these ultra-rigorous ideas and this hatred of the faith. But at the same time, they didn't realize it amongst themselves that they were actually hateful towards Catholicism because they were ignorant of Catholicism. And so he simply would put out leaflets, whereas one piece of paper, and it'd have a commonly held objection from the Protestants, and then it would have a simple, well laid out explanation of the Catholic response to that, the Catholic rationale behind its beliefs. And the Protestants soon found themselves reading these leaflets and realizing that not only did it make sense, but also that they no longer harbored as much hate in their hearts after having learned more about the faith than they had prior to picking up the leaflet. There was one town in particular near Geneva named Thonen, and Thonen was vehemently against him, and yet he continually worked to try to get an inroad there in the city. It was said that he was the people there so opposed him that it was illegal for him to even offer Mass or any of the sacraments there in the city. And so when you would have Mass, you'd have to say it across the river on the other side in technically a different town, so if anybody wanted to come to him. Also, when he would go on sick call in Thonen, you know, when he wasn't being pursued to try to be killed, but he had started to gain some converts, yet the government and the people in charge were still very much against him. He'd have to secretly go on sick call. He couldn't carry the Blessed Sacrament openly and do so in a way that it would have like a proper procession with candles and the bell and everything like that to lead him to where he was going to bring the Blessed Sacrament to somebody who was sick. Instead, he'd have to take small picks, hang around his neck, and put it inside of his cassock, there hanging over his heart. And then he'd take a big cloak and he'd wrap it around himself against the weather, and he'd have a hat on and he'd have the brim lowered, and he'd just kind of curl up inward of himself, lean forward and keep his head down and walk through the street. And that way, his eyes would just be continually focused, just walking where he was going without the distractions around him. So he himself could meditate upon the Blessed Sacrament being there pressed against his breast. Well, the faithful had learned that this was what he looked like when he went in that procession of the Holy Eucharist. And so they, for their part, would wait till he passed by and then give him a little bit of a gap so that they could not be conspicuous with their following, but they would then fall in line behind him, and you would end up with this impromptu and very subdued Eucharistic procession through the streets of Thonen as those who are faithful continue to adore and to give reverence to our Lord passing by. Finally, Francis de Sales would have his breakthrough moment, and it came when least expected it. He was saying Mass on St. Stephen's Day, and it was across the river in the town next to Thonen, and he rang the bell for the announcement of the start of Mass. And what had happened was that it was a terrible snow day. Lots of snow had fallen, And as is often the case, people decided it was just too nasty outside to get to church. And so he had the entire church opened and ready to go, and only 7 people showed up on the Feast of St. Stephen. And that was okay. He smiled at them as they came through the doors, and he went to the pulpit during the Mass, and he began to preach. And he began to say his sermon by stating that one soul was as precious to him as thousands. And then he talked simply about the power and the importance of the invocation of the saints. One of the 7 men that was there for Mass was the magistrate from the town of Tonin. He had earlier on been somewhat converted by Francis de Sales, but his faith was very weak. And the pressure from the Calvinists in power around him in Tonin began to really wear on him, and he had already resolved in his mind that he was going to return back to Calvinism come this upcoming Thursday afterwards. Yet as he was walking down the street on St. Stephen's Day, he heard the bell ring. He was moved by grace to come to the church, and then at hearing the sermon by the holy man in the pulpit, he fell to his knees and began to weep. And his faith was finally solidified in his soul. And he told St. Francis de Sales afterwards that he would never ever abandon the faith, and that he would do all he could to promote his work there in town. And from that time forward, Francis was allowed to say Mass and to preach publicly in the city of Tonin. It was said that in that area, when all was said and done, of all the work that he had done throughout the area near Geneva, over 72,000 souls were gained from Calvinism to Catholicism. And those quiet little processions of the sick calls being made turned into great celebrations of 40 hours devotion, and to which thousands of people had come, and Eucharistic processions through the streets in which people would be singing loudly and proudly the litanies of the saints, and all of the great devotions that he could participate in. Ultimately, it led him to one day finally being consecrated as the Bishop of Geneva, in which he still continued to do all the same work, except he had a bigger territory to cover. And he would sit and he would teach catechism, and he would preach every single day, and he would especially preach to the children and teach them the basic aspects of the faith. And he did this until he completely wore himself out. In the end, there was a trip that he had to make to visit the king that was going to be the last bit of his life. He went on this journey back to Paris, where he fell ill, and soon it was clear that his health was failing him. And as he left the king, they thought soon he would die, and he was subjected to all these barbarous sort of end-of-life treatment procedures that, in some way, I guess, is similar to some of the things that we unfortunately continue to do with the last-ditch efforts of trying to sustain life. The doctors came to him, and that they began to try to restore health to this dying man, and then rather than just letting him go. And it included things like applying hot irons to the base of his neck, and a red-hot steel ball to the top of his head that burned all the way down to the skull. I don't know exactly what they were trying to succeed in doing, but in the end, of course, St. Francis de Sales, patiently enduring those things, finally gave up his soul to the God who had served so faithfully. And so with that feast day, and all that we can learn from him, is so much more than simply stated in this little sermon. It reminds us that each opportunity that we have for those prayers and those devotions and those sermons and the learning of our faith, and conveying our faith, opportunities to teach our faith, everything that we do that we think is just a small action A small little prayer, a small little devotion, a little bit of catechism, they, in the end, amount to so much good for souls. And so never look at that little catechism class, or that little instruction, or that opportunity to teach somebody about our faith as something that doesn't mean a whole lot because it's just one person and it's just one story and it's just one aspect. No. It chips away at that little by little to gain more and more souls for heaven. And that was that way, that patient way of St. Francis de Sales that gained thousands for that same cause. May God bless you in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen.